Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in. Today, we're going to talk about the impact of the European elections, regional divisions, what is currently at stake, and what is likely to unfold soon. First, I'd like to introduce today's panelist, to Nguyen, Deputy Director at the Jacques Delors Center, László Bruszt, Director at the CEU Democracy Institute, Peter Greco, Director at Political Capital Institute, and Claudio Radaelli, Professor at the European University Institute. First, I'd like to turn to László. I know you mention often this in your work. How does the East-West and North-South divide in the EU shape the decision-making?
Thank you. The East-West and North-South on the surface of it divides are different. So the East-West is primarily about rule of law, democracy, about institutions, and the North-South is about the monetary union and financial rules. But then below that, there are also differences in the exposure to the weaknesses of European monetary and economic integration. They are exposed to different kinds of challenges. So the Southerners, who are the Southern economies, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Italy, they are finance and credit-based growth models that are very much dependent on financial markets and on money markets in general. And for them, keeping the rules of the EU and getting financial support at the time of crisis is much more important than in the East, where these are FDI-based economies with much more patient type of capital. So problems are different. And when we talk later, and I will stop here, so when we talk later about how that can affect crisis or solution to crisis, this kind of differences make a very important difference in the longer term, actually from the longer term perspective of EU.
And I'm wondering, have these divisions strengthened or weakened throughout the EU integration?
The divisions in the East-West relations are not as problematic, and they've played a role actually in very one-sided management of the monetary crisis, because the Westerners, that was primarily a North-South dilemma that was solved in an ambiguous way. For the East-West dilemma, this is now, at least the political part, is primarily Hungary versus the 26 other countries. So the FDI-based economies of East are doing fine.
And how does the current crisis strengthen European integration? You can also touch on, the history of EU responses of the crisis.
EU integration is strengthened or weakened by crisis in case when the crises are simultaneous, when at the same time the two peripheries and the core are hit at the same time, like that was the case of the COVID crisis, or the geopolitical or geoeconomic challenges that are increasing now. They are again simultaneous problems in which all the three regions or parts of EU are affected, and that they might help to induce search for mutually beneficial solutions, like it happened during the COVID crisis or after the COVID crisis. But these are still open questions, and I'm really wondering what my colleagues think about these issues.
While we were having this discussion, I would like to encourage our audience to send us questions, and we will ask our panelists later on. I will now turn to Claudio. Let's look at the legislative program that will emerge in the following 6 months or so. What should be done to make sure that the new EP and the Commission proceed in a coherent way? Will an institutional agreement on the content of new legislation be sufficiently robust, given the composition of the new EP and the lessons we learned from the studies of lawmaking in the EU in the past?
Thank you, Flora, for this question. I'm just going slow to make sure that everyone can hear my voice. I see people nodding, so that's the case, that you can hear me. Okay, so the story here is that the initiative of legislation belongs to the European Commission, and that's in the treaties. However, the European Parliament has many ways to influence the European Commission. To begin with, is the Parliament that votes on the commissioners, so they can put the bar as high as they wish when they question the commissioners. Let's assume that we go through the stage where the Parliament has nominated the commissioners suggested by the Council, so by the Prime Ministers and Head of States, and we have a fully formed Commission and European Parliament. And then the game starts. Formally, it's the Commission that presents a legislative program. However, it would make no sense to suggest legislation that is in contrast with the prevailing majority of the European Parliament, and therefore, following reason, and not this time politics, following reason, it would make sense, as you said, to have an interinstitutional agreement that sets the broad lines of what the new legislation is about to become. Now, unfortunately, we know from the history of lawmaking in the previous legislatures that when it comes to voting on individual bills, the Parliament, the members of the European Parliament are split along two lines. One is national. There are cases where no matter what the politics is at the moment, some MEPs just vote for their country, what they think is the interest of their country. And therefore, every prediction about how they're going to vote unfolds along national lines. And the other that we're seeing, again, on several occasions, is a sort of cleavage that I would call about a precaution versus innovation, or ecology versus competitiveness. So for these reasons, we're going to see probably attempts to create a kind of unified view at the beginning of what legislation will be. And then across the months, unfortunately, it's going to be politics as usual with these two cleavages, national and the other one more about the role of industry versus the role of the environment, unfolding the overall coherence. So it's going to be an uphill battle on each and every file of new legislation.
And what are the policy dilemmas and controversies about the future of European industry that the new EP will have to tackle with the Commission and the EP? Will economic policies be central or residual of geopolitical decisions?
Yeah, this is very interesting because 10 years ago, with the financial crisis coming to a close, we said that the economy matters, the macroeconomy, the financial markets, and now I think it's more of a geopolitical European Union. Also, we can talk about the appointment of Kallas as a foreign policy spokesperson for the EU, but everything since the war of the Ukraine, even more in the Commission and the EU at large, is geopolitical. That means that economic policies are residual, so they come after the geopolitical choices. And here is there are two interesting ways to connect the two. One is the fact that we have to find a way to get our industry up on its feet again after COVID, after the pandemic. And the US, the United States of America, it's a country that's done a lot just by spending money, with something called the Inflation Reduction Act. That has nothing to do with inflation. We see also German companies buying it in the US. So it is attractive, but it comes with a lot of money. The European Union has state aid rules, so you cannot just send aids to industry. And those rules are patrolled by the European Commission. So you cannot do something like spending money to aid or help industry as such. And there is a lot of discussion about whether, in the name of the geopolitical EU that has to stand up to China and to the US, we should water down the rules of state aid. But imagine that we do so. Where are the resources for these new state aids? Where are these euros that have to be spent on industry? And at the national level, these resources are capped by the deficit. So countries like Germany can spend more on their industry than countries like Italy that has more deficit. Another option would be instead to have a common debt at the EU level, and that's something that even countries like the Netherlands are prepared to discuss. And that would be really a revolution to see watering down of state aid rules, a more interventionist competition policy, and money coming directly from Europe and distributed. László mentioned asymmetries, right? No winners and losers, all industry gets something. And that's a very optimistic scenario. And the other thing, if I may say, where the geopolitical intersect the economic, is the external projection of the Green Deal, especially the common border adjustment mechanism envisaged by the EU, whereby we're gonna kind of tax stuff that comes from outside the EU that has not been taxed for the CO2. And this is a controversy, obviously. Countries like India, they've called it protectionism in disguise. Again, a geopolitical union could say, it's not about the economy here, it's about that we want a transition, and we are prepared to fight on this. And that's two examples where politics or geopolitics comes before the economy.
And is the new constellation likely to support the Green Deal implementation, or does it backtrack on the ecological transition?
Okay, this is just a bit of a speculation that I see the Green Deal running into the problem of too many losers in the short term and too few winners and all in the long term. And those who are penalized in the short term complain loudly. Now, the losers of the Green Deal, those who are penalized, are speaking loudly internally and externally. And obviously, we know the results of the elections. We've seen, we haven't seen the Liberals and the Greens making big steps ahead, exactly the opposite. So we don't have a green European Parliament. I expect the EU to do more compensation of the losers, to do slower implementation. So let's go slowly with the rules. Okay, greenhouses, but not tomorrow, let's wait a bit more. And externalization, let's talk about our common border adjustment mechanism. Let's talk to India, let's talk to the US. Maybe, we can agree. And so it's not gonna be the big transformation. And the question is, how much can you compensate, water down, go slow in implementation, and still achieve your carbon neutral objectives, and still be in the Green Deal and not in something else. There is a limit where watered down rules are no longer the rules you had in mind. So that's a big dilemma.
Thank you. And now we're going to dive into something super interesting again. It's about the far right. And I'd like to ask to Nguyen about Germany. So the far right AfD took second place in the EU election. What are the reasons behind the strengthening of the far right in Germany and also in Europe? It seems like these extremist parties are shrinking mainstream parties that have dominated the German political scene since the 90s. What are the reasonings behind that?
Let me preface this with Thank you very much for organizing the panel. Very happy to be here and to just discuss the implications. I'm not a political scientist, so as a matter of fact, I do not know the reasons exactly why there is a surge of the far right. I think what we can say is that it is, of course, development that we are seeing across the continent, and that there has been a shift in the entire European Parliament towards the right, perhaps not as much as has been feared in the beginning of the year. So we do still have a majority of the center coalitions. We do still have a majority of Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, and the Liberals. I think this is important to say just in terms of numbers. Even though the question is, of course, in how far has the center coalition and the center actually also shifted to the right, right? So the shift to the right, it's not just the question how many seats do the far-right parties have, but also where does the center actually locate itself in terms of policies. And I think this is something that that still needs to be discussed quite a bit, and not just how many seats did the far-right parties get. In Germany, it is true the AfD was the second largest party in the EP elections. They received a lot less seats than was expected even less than a year ago. I think in autumn they polled much better than they did in the end. Might have been also due to all of the scandals that we of course saw with the AfD, espionage, the being excluded from the ID group. And still, I think in terms of considering the scandals that they did endure, they did quite well. I think they have about 16 seats in the parliament. And what we saw in Germany specifically, and this sort of goes for the entire election results, and I think, of course, then the way the AfD plays in is part of it, is that these European Parliament elections were very much decided through national politics and also dissatisfaction with the national government. So there was surveys afterwards that really said also in comparison to 2019, the national election, the national political circumstances played a much bigger role than European policy. So it was really also decided on national politics and not so much European politics. And there's also an decreasing perception, it's still a majority, but a decreasing perception in Germany of the benefits that the European Union provides for Germany, both politically and economically. So we're seeing a sort of decline also in how citizens or voters seem to perceive what benefits the EU bring. And then there's, of course, somewhat of a regional divide in Germany as well when it comes to the votes of the AfD. So they're very strong, in particular in Eastern Germany. They were surprisingly strong with younger voters as well, more than was expected. This was the first time that in Germany voters could vote as of 16. So I think there is a bit of also regional divisions, which looking forward is, I think, a bit worrying in terms of that we have regional elections in a few länder in Germany in autumn, and this was also seen as sort of the indication how will the regional elections go, and of course how will the federal elections go next year. Right, so in Germany, the parliament elections were also very much discussed and interpreted in the national context, both how the current government is being seen not very good, and actually they're quite weakened by the results at European level or for the Parliament elections, but also what do we draw from this for this autumn and for next autumn.
If we look at the EP election results, we see that there is no major change. The People Party is strong, the coalition is united. However, if we look on a member state level, we see that the French and German far right has strengthened. What is the reason behind this discrepancy?
I mean, I think that is easily explained also simply by the size of the French and German delegations. If you also look at the loss of the Green seat at European level, a lot of it is driven by the loss in France and Germany, because France and Germany have so many seats. Germany has, I think, 96 seats, France 81 or so. And of course, in proportion, if a party loses out very much in France and Germany, or wins a lot in France and Germany, that directly translates to the European level, but then can be balanced out perhaps by other member states, but the loss of the Greens were very much driven by the loss of the Greens in these two countries, simply because of the way that the seats are calculated. I think what I thought was maybe interesting or striking with these elections, talking about France and Germany, is how much of an impact the EP elections had on the national level. Right, so they are always treated as the second-order elections, maybe less important. Maybe they are discussed on national issues, which is true, but the impact that then they had in the aftermath, in fact, at the national level was quite striking. In Germany, we're really seeing a weakened government, and in France, well, we have elections, the results of which are still outstanding, but in essence, chaos, right? In two of, well, a weakened Germany and chaos in the other very, very big member state. And this is really then, I think, also a consequence that I don't know if anybody foresaw, but that will have very, very wide implications for the next 5 years, not just in the European Parliament, which will probably be more or less continuous, but in the Council and European Council. So I think the next 5 years will be much more complicated, not because of the results in the EP, but really because of the repercussions that it had in the member states.
Let's talk about the political repercussions of the French elections as well. I think it's a question to everyone because the results are fairly new, and for our audience, I will say that Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally won about 34% of the votes in the first round, becoming the biggest political force in the French parliament. The new Popular Front, the left-wing coalitions, was at 27%, and Macron's Together Alliance was about 20%. The turnout was very high, about 65% of eligible voters cast ballots. And my question is, how much can the weakening of the governments in the two most powerful member states change the EU? This is a question to Nguyen, but to all of you, so please, László.
Sorry. Yes, I think for the French elections, I think it is also still important to say that we don't know yet, because of the way the French system is designed. It is now, of course, still a question how each individual district will in fact turn out, whether or not it will be 2 or 3 candidates that run against each other. So there's been a lot of strategic callings for candidates that are in the third place to pull out, to let the second runner have better chances against Le Pen's party. So I think there's still a lot of strategic considerations happening, and the percentages do not tell us so much yet what the end results will be. So I think that is still open, though I think the direction is very clear that it will be a parliament with a very strong far-right, Rassemblement National, if not a majority. And that will, of course, have implications for the European Union. It will have implications for France and the French position in the EU. I think from what I hear, it is not as clear-cut, because we've never been in a situation in France where we had a president and a government that is so fundamentally opposed. And what that would mean and how it is divided. I think even the question who would then send the French commissioner is not that clear-cut. Right? So even these little procedural things, is it then the president, is it the prime minister, that is still all to be worked out, but of course would mean a weakened Franco-German axis at the European level, so less push for European integration from both, if not even a country that will not have a position or will be able to actively work against EU positions. It will have a big impact on questions if it would be a prime minister in France from Rassemblement National. I think will have quite implications for Ukraine policy, but also for the budget negotiations. We're already hearing that Le Pen wants to cut or wants rebate on the French contribution to the budget, and that, of course, then comes in together with a new Dutch government that also does not want to increase the EU budget, depending on who sits in the German government next year. So I think we will have very difficult constellations, and really a very weakened Franco-German axis, which is why it is all the more important that we have a good team in Brussels, right? So I think the team that has been now proposed at the summit last week is actually a very, very good team. And I think it is all the more important that Ursula von der Leyen will now be elected in the Parliament, because if we also get political chaos in Brussels, if she falls through, I think it would simply be very difficult and honestly rather scary.
Thank you. Laszlo, you also raised your hand.
Yeah, briefly wanted to provoke my colleagues. Perhaps I'm dead wrong, so I make a try. But I think that behind these French elections, there is a big longer-term dilemma of these French and German relationships to integration. So the French have always wanted to link deepening of economic integration to political integration, at least since Delors. And when the monetary integration came up, again, they were pressing for some political integration, deepening political integration. Now, deepening of political integration for German chancellors, since basically Kohl, meant that we have to pay more for the South and for the less efficient economies. They would like to have, basically for the Germans, extension of markets is about getting 340 million large market for free, or at least for 1% of the EU GDP, centralizing. So the French politicians always entered, and I think Macron entered into this trap. They're trying to be the best pupil in the class, to deepen economic integration, play by the rules, try to have all these requirements of Maastricht, or at least most of it, without considering its social and economic repercussions, consequences. And that he pays the price for that, because he couldn't ever convince Schulz or the German political class to consider any kind of deepening, centralizing or redistributing more for managing this kind of problem. So that's, I think, in the longer run, what the French voters' message was. Enough is enough. They don't see that being the best pupil in the class and talking about deepening Europe without caring about what's going on in France just didn't work. But that's my personal view. I wonder what my esteemed colleagues think about that.
I have left the conversation for a while accidentally, so I might, hopefully we are still at the repercussion of the French questions. Okay, so thank you, and thanks for all of you for being here in this discussion. Really glad that we can discuss these topics together in this nice company. So just very briefly, I do think that, first of all, we have to wait and see, of course, the second round of elections in France. But on the other hand, one big question might be that how much, if the far right gets on government first, having the legislative power and then the executive power, how much it, in France, how much it could follow the Giorgia Meloni route, in the sense that it following a more more mainstream economic policy, and mainstream economists say that high indebtedness usually helps you to be a bit moderate, and this is what happened in the case of Italy as well. But I think Claudio can tell it better than me. That high indebtedness of Italy is part of the reason why Giorgia Meloni is following more mainstream economic policies. it might not explain entirely why he follows a more mainstream foreign policy, because it could be also the way on having a bigger impact on EU decision making. But that's, I think, a question. If they would like to follow, let's say, the Meloni route with mainstream economic policy and a bit mainstream foreign policy in terms of not making any U-turns or softening their tone regarding the sanctions, regarding the support of Ukraine, being more pro-Ukrainian, and I already see some deep, divergence in that direction, or will they follow the route of Viktor Orban, that I find rather unlikely, in the case of having a very different foreign policy stance than the rest of the European Union, first. Second, to go into foreign policy adventurism that does not seem to pay off that well, if we take a look at the current economic figures in Hungary. So in short, I do think that most of the cases in the European Union teach us that if far-right gets on power, usually it loses most of its radicalism. And especially if you are a leading country of the European Union, you just can't, if you make some mess, that it falls back on you through the Eurozone. So that's why I think that probably the leash for a possible far-right government, or a government is led by the far-right in France, or even so, if in the next presidential election there would be a far-right president of France, I think the leash would be probably a bit shorter than we expect, but it might be just wishful thinking. So I'm happy to hear what other colleagues think about that.
László.
The leash is different for those member states that depend on money markets and those that don't. So the reason why even after 2012, Orban remains so radical and actually deepens even his radicalism, is that he depends on FDI. And FDI is much more patient. It's not, doesn't change from one day to another. Money markets change. Meloni is very cautious because she knows that the spread can change from one day to another. So, and it depends on what the investment companies think and what the rating agencies, and first of all, what is the evaluation of the commission. So the leash is there, as Peter, you said, is short. That's not the case for the East.
I would like to circle back to Peter because he mentioned Viktor Orban. And he has transformative plans to create a new political group. He spoke about it quite a few times. Do you think Orban can form a relevant counterforce in the EU?
Yes, I think it's an important question, even if Hungary is usually regarded to be more important within the European Union, I think, than it really is. And in the current situation, I think it can just become more clear than ever. And in the European Parliament, I think we have one very important rule: size does matter, and the size of the delegation that you can bring in the European Parliament matters, and it is dependent on the size of the country. And Hungary, while some has some other ambitions within the country, but Hungary, in a European scale, is a small country. If we take a look at the three groups that were delivering a press conference yesterday, it's Babis's ANO, the FPÖ, and Orban's Fidesz, they all together have only a bit more MEPs in the European Parliament than the French Front National has in itself. And even if we talk about mainstream, even if we talk about mainstream political forces, and if we talk about more radical political forces, I think that you usually have need one big member state to be the backbone of it. And I don't really see who will be the backbone for this small group that Orban wants to create. According to some, and we just shouldn't forget that János Jansa, who the party of whom is the European People's Party, called it a fake news when Hungarian decision makers told that he has some ambition to lead the European People's Party and join into a new grouping. Robert Fico and also Pellegrini is much more busy to rebuilding ties with the S&D group. So the other important rule in the European Parliament is that everyone wants to gravitate toward the center. And I think it's a big question, what could be the gravity in this situation of Viktor Orbán? So I'm really skeptical that he can form his own group in itself. Giorgia Meloni does not want him in ECR. She made it crystal clear. And these are just, I think, options, partially for the Hungarian audience, to show that he's still relevant. And also these are options for, of course, other European forces to make to try to seem relevant. And of course, but Andrej Babiš's party can be the next governmental party in the Czech Republic. FPÖ, with a high chance, can be a next governmental party, possibly even a senior governmental party in the next Austrian government. So I would not say that these players are irrelevant. I would rather think that these are the information that appeared in the Italian press today, that it's happening with the knowledge of Marine Le Pen. And I think Marine Le Pen is on a winning track at the moment. I'm highly skeptical if many groups would like to leave the ID when its dominant force is on a winning track and gravitate somewhere else. If it will be a subsection or a Eastern European subsection, to say so, of the Identity and Democracy Party, I think it's more realistic. But it's anyone but Orbán who will really reshape the European party system.
Claudio?
Yeah, there's something that is very important for the general audience that we have on YouTube, not the super specialists, is that our mind is always concentrating on what is spectacular and new, and obviously France is new. The Hungarian presidency is something new, so it's correct that we talk about this. But there are also elements of continuity across elections, and the fact remains that the European People's Party is somewhat the winner and the stable winner of this election, together with S&D, stable, not a winner. They are losers for sure. Those are the Lib Dems and to some extent the Greens. Then across countries we see elements of stability. So on the French case is spectacular, but we haven't seen the last word with the two steps of the electoral French system and the way the constituencies works. We also have a possible stable player in the European Parliament. And regarding the right, I can see that what we talked about Meloni. What Meloni does is constrained on the one hand by the financial markets, by the European situation. And by the way, France is as well into the excessive deficit procedure, so there are also constraints on France. But also she's constrained by the League, by Salvini. Salvini was a loser at these elections, but clearly all the movements that we see with Orbán, ID, the right is, I'm not saying fragmented, but it's not composed into a single line. We have some leaders of the right that are in government, that lead, others that are in coalition governments like Salvini, but would like the current prime minister to be a little bit less successful when she goes to Europe. So on this, I don't see, probably on this I'm in line with the other speakers, a single big European proposition coming from what we call the populist right in Europe, but attempts to kind of recombine in different ways And these recombinations are not easy transitions for those involved.
Thank you. I would like to circle back for one more question to Peter. Can you dive into what we can expect from the Hungarian EU presidency?
Yes, absolutely. And I've heard that I was turned upside down for a while. So hopefully I'm in the right shape at the moment and the right direction. So yeah, very briefly, I think Hungarian presidency will not be that super important if we are honest to ourselves for many reasons. I mean, two most important. First is that the other member states did their very best to empty it as much as possible and to do all the important decisions, especially regarding EU integration of Eastern Partnership countries and let's say transfers to Ukraine, where they found some legal solutions also to circumvent Hungary and the veto of Hungary. So they did their best to do the most important decisions before, and also on the leaders of the European Union before the European Council presidency begins. Second is that this is a transformational period where usually in the second half of the year is less important in terms of presidency than the first half of the year. It's especially so when we have this transformation, there will be simply less decisions to make because the important bodies are just being set up. I think Orbán originally prepared for a rather professional, smooth presidency without any major scandals to prove that he is a very important leader of the European Union and that he's someone that is an inherent part of the club, even if he is different in his values. I think if we take a look at how Orbán behaved when he met with Gerhard Scholz recently, I think he was much less combatant than he usually is. So with the German chancellor, he was just much more, how to say, following the mainstream rhetorics than what he does at home. So I think it gives us a bit of indication that he is not always this radical politician he presents himself on the European stage. But on the other hand, I think the less he can be integrated in the European bodies and especially in the European Parliament in some relevant groups, the more he will get frustrated and the more I think the presidency can be somehow a hostage of this Hungarian nationalistic mindset. And I think what could be partially important is that if Donald Trump is re-elected, then at the time of the re-election, not at the time of the inauguration, but at the time of the re-election, Viktor Orbán will preside the European Council, and that based on the slogan of the Hungarian presidency, "Make Europe Great Again," we cannot have too much doubts that Orbán will try to exploit the most possible from his friendship with Donald Trump, and emphasizing much more the importance of this transatlantic ties that he does not find that important these days. But if Trump is elected, he will find them super important again. So I think he will be very busy with trying to highlight the differences within the European Union regarding an incoming new or old new president. We can say this way, but otherwise, I think presidencies in general are not always that super important, especially if they are run by a small member state, and especially if it is run by a small member state that is known to be a troublemaker. So I think all the important European decision makers have tried their best to minimize the possible problems and troubles that the Hungarian presidency can possibly cause.
Thank you. You kind of answered my last questions. I wanted to touch on the new slogan, "Make Europe Great Again," and what it signals for the Hungarian presidency. But you kind of touched on it. But if you have any other thoughts on why you think he chose that slogan, if we can expect any similarities with the Trump presidency, Is it just a signal of his friendship to Donald Trump, or what it means for his EU presidency?
Yeah, I think it's simple trolling, nothing else, and that's what I think the interesting, how to say, contradiction is going to be. That on the one hand, Orban really tries to, and Orban thought that this European Parliament election will be his royal route back to the Euro-Atlantic mainstream. Part of the ECR and having good friendship with Donald Trump, he thought that this is a perfect setup for returning somehow to your Atlantic mainstream that he feels pretty sidelined in for good reasons. But on the one hand, to reaching that aim, you really have to run, in Europe at least, a rather silent, professional, smoothly organized presidency. But on the other hand, the Hungarian governmental policies and the policies of Fidesz were just built on this principle to make as much trouble as possible. And I think there is some inertia of this kind of policies. So I would tend to think that there will be some scandals, even if they were not originally planned during the presidency. And we shouldn't forget that there are two institutions against which the so-called Hungarian Sovereignty Protection Office, it's so-called because it defends anything but the Hungarian sovereignty. So these institutions have launched investigation against two human rights institution and Transparency Institution, Transparency International Hungary, and an investigative journalist site called Átlátszó, that both were doing tremendous job in uncovering corrupt practices in Hungary, and the international repercussions of this decision are not very nice, to say the least. So I think that this is what. So I think that for Orban it's just more difficult to make even short-term changes of direction in his policy, for example, regarding the EU presidency, because of the inertia of his increasingly illiberal regime.
László, you also wanted to add something to this question.
Thanks. What I think that Claudio already mentioned, this issue of geopolitics. That geopolitics gets more and more important, and the EU has to find its relationship to this Russia-Ukraine problem, then the US-China dilemma, and then the US election in general. So these geopolitical dilemmas are there. Now, Orban is the only person within the EU who tries to be playing these geopolitical cards at the same time, simultaneously. It's a very dangerous game for him. He might lose a lot or he might gain a lot, but he plays that. So he tries to be good at the same times in Beijing, in Moscow, in Brussels, and in Washington. And this game he has been playing now. And for him, presidency doesn't, not what matters is not what are the actual points, but to show what Peter also said, is that he's a player. He has to show he matters in Beijing, in Washington, or in Moscow to the degree that he's a player within EU. He would not, if he gets marginalized within the EU, then he would lose his relevance for these three other capitals. So he has to show that he matters. I think that's the most important from the perspective of presidency, or now trying to create its affection within the European Parliament.
Thank you, László. We also have a question from the audience. What are the main drivers of the electoral shift to the far right in Europe? Could the panel tease out key factors that made the electorate turn to the right and large both in CEE and the West? And the far right is in a parentheses, so it's also asking if shift to the right. this is a question, I think, for all of you. We discussed it quite in detail. Claudio.
Yeah, I'm the least credible person to answer such a big question because I'm not an expert on political parties. But I read an article by another Italian political scientist called Maurizio Ferrera, who is very well known in political science, and he was talking about where is hope and where is fear today amongst the citizens of the EU. And it calls, is the EU project hope today, or is it project fear? And perhaps in the last maybe 20 years, I've been talking about the EU from the point of view of fear. We need the EU, otherwise the financial markets will come in. Otherwise, it's going to be poverty. There is no. Otherwise, we're going to lose technology. So always, like the EU, yes, but that also explains a bit of Brexit and explains some alienation. And then in the last, after 5 years, we've seen the EU as hope, right? The Green Deal, the Artificial Intelligence Act, the desire to lead on the ecological and digital transition, except that for some reasons, I say this was not very attractive to the young generation. So when the EU is not hope, but is we have to do it otherwise, it's scary, so it's fear that leads us to the EU, then I think people prefer to find hope in what? In what they know better, which is their country, nostalgia, the world as it was before. And that's very, very human. And there is nothing wrong with that hope, right? Hope that traditional values will still be with us, hope in the family, hope. And everything else looks fear, disruptive. Now, I am a liberally oriented person, so that's not attractive on me, but it may be attractive on many others. So why did people vote for the right, far right? Because maybe provides some hope instead of fear. And hope is a very cozy place to go when you have no other person or institution that inspires you. And for some reasons, the Green Deal has not inspired, scared with all the tractors, all the incendiary politics that has created in the last year or so.
Thank you. We have another question, a really good question from the audience. What could the result of the EP elections and national elections this year mean for the EU's policy towards Ukraine?
Oh, it's so good that someone asked about Ukraine, because one of the most important geopolitical and integration-based challenges is Ukraine. Integration on enlargement now again is intimately interlinked with the issue of geopolitics. And the EU elections hopefully, and I really stress hopefully, will not mean a negative change. So the centrist parties remaining dominance and the support of the action of Meloni means that hopefully it will not weaken support to Ukraine. But the real question, that's the most elementary form of solidarity with Ukraine. The real question is whether this coalition that stays, the core coalition, will that strong enough to rethink the integration, the issues of enlargement. Usually before, in the previous enlargements, there was a separation of deepening, meaning finding out new ways of deeper integration. and widening, meaning bringing in new geographic areas and new countries, new member states. Here in Ukraine, the deep association agreement and the unfolding social, political, military crisis showed that the integration of Ukraine will not be successful without some deepening within the EU, within managing better the social, economic, political consequences of imposing tens of thousands of pages of regulations on Ukraine. So that will be crucial, and that will be also the biggest challenge for EU to find out new ways, new strategies of integrating, of course, not just Ukraine, we're talking also Ukraine, Moldova, and perhaps also other countries, both from the East and from the Western Balkans.
Peter.
Yeah, thank you. So I would share László's optimism on that hopefully the support towards Ukraine, even if we know that it's a hesitant support and in not all the member states everyone is so honestly enthusiastic about support of Ukraine, but so, and this is also fragile, but I think it will hold, and for two reasons. One is that what László also mentioned, that mainstream remain strong, and the parts of the not mainstream, like Giorgia Meloni's ECR, is more hawkish than the mainstream of the European Union. But the second important point is that if we take a look at the level of the member state, we have seen so many governments on power since 2014 who, in opposition, mostly promised to cut the sanctions against Russia immediately, to cut the support towards Ukraine immediately, to make a U-turn in Ukraine-related policies. And then when they become governmental forces, we can also remind ourselves to the government of Lega and the Five-Star Movement that was very harshly pro-Russian in many sense and critical towards Ukraine, or the Syriza-led Greek government, and they did not really make any change. And in the European Council, they mainly went with the mainstream. Also, Robert Fico, for example, in government is much more mainstream when it comes to his votes in Ukraine-related issues than he was on opposition. So maybe the only exception to this rule, and it's not a total exception, is Hungary, but we can also see that Hungary can stand in the line if it faces strong pressure. First, second, Hungary's veto can be circumvented in some cases, not all the cases. So I think that this support can hold, but I also do think, and it comes back to the previous question and the point that Claudio and László, and I think also Nguyen made about the increasing the geopolitical nature of the European Union, which I think is a good thing on the one hand, and in some sense during the defending Ukraine, I think Europe could show its strength. On the other hand, similarly as too much foreign policy, too much involvement into conflicts in foreign policy for US voters, it can create a backlash and lead to some kind of isolationism, a feeling that, okay, why do we invest that much in Ukraine if, let's say, American pensioners could receive more instead, or French pensioners could receive more instead, or Italian, and list goes on. So why do we care that much about the problem of outside players? Why don't we focus more on ourselves? So I think there is also a backlash in Europe currently, and I don't think that this Ukraine fatigue is that strong than we usually assume. According to polls, most of the public opinion is still supportive in Europe towards Ukraine. But one of the reasons why parts of the far right, and especially around ID group, got stronger was that many voters in European Union feel that Europe does too much for Ukraine. I don't think that good politicians have to take it into account, because there is still enough supporters of of Ukraine in Europe. But this is a factor, and the longer the war starts, I think the stronger this pressure on some politicians can become to, let's say, to make more steps towards some kind of peace. And this short course towards peace are usually not heading towards a good direction.
Nguyen?
I agree with what Peter and László said about the support in Europe on Ukraine, but I think the elections that will matter for Ukraine are probably not so much the EU elections, but the US elections that we are seeing in fall, right? So I think in terms of where does the future of support for Ukraine, where is it headed, and what will matter, I think it will be the elections in November across the pond and not so much on our continent. And I think the question is then more, how do we prepare for a second Trump presidency, and how do the EU government sort of make contingencies for that scenario, which seems more likely and more likely. But I would say that those are the elections that matter really for this question.
Mm. If I can step into that, I agree completely with that. And I think that we were talking about earlier about whether crisis can matter or not. Since the formation of EU integration, starting of European integration, and starting of integration studies, the crises are always there as potential sources of change. Most of the crises don't make change. First of all, those crises that only hit one group of countries or a smaller group of countries. Very few crises hit the whole EU. Trump election would hit the whole EU. That will increase dramatically the geopolitical crisis that Claudio already mentioned, and that will be very important, and that might strengthen desire to have common defense, develop not just the security of Europe, but also the geo-economic consolidation of Europe. So why, of course, it's normal to be afraid of what comes after Trump if he is re-elected. But one of the things that I expected that will mean a pressure on EU member states to also think much deeper about the future of Europe.
Thank you. We have another question from our audience. They're asking what democratizing reforms of the EU do you consider both desirable and feasible in the coming years?
I think there's a big difference between desirable and feasible in the next years. I think in terms of democratizing reforms was the question, so institutional reforms. I think we've had somewhat of a optimistic wave that came with enlargement as a new priority of the EU, where we briefly thought that maybe reforms would be on the agenda and something that could happen. And I think in the past months it has slipped off the agenda again. I think there's a variety of reforms that can be discussed and that are desirable, one of which is, of course, always the everlasting question of unanimity and whether or not it should be abolished to prevent the likes of Viktor Orban to block decisions of the EU. I think that is a big part of the question. But quite frankly, I think in the political mood that we have in the EU right now and in the member states, I'm not sure that we will see far-reaching right reforms anytime soon. I think there's both the sense that there are bigger problems than reforming the EU institutionally, and also simply not enough support, I think, in the national governments at the moment for any kind of reform that would go in that direction. That being said, I'm happy to see that at least the Spitzenkandidaten procedure worked this time around, or seem to have worked with the member states, which I think for EU democracy, at least it's not the rollback that we saw in 2019. So that is something that that went well, but I'm not very optimistic that we will see far-reaching reforms in the next few years, to be honest.
Claudio?
Yeah, I completely agree. But that's also the source of a problem of why the EU is not Project Hope, that is not perceived as sufficiently democratic. There are maybe two pathways that seem desirable and somewhat feasible. One is the intensification of European citizens' initiatives that now they have their place in the ecosystem of the European Union, and those are initiatives for new legislation coming from a sufficiently high number of citizens from at least 7 countries, etc., etc. So one thing that it would be very nice is to see these initiatives creating little by little the platforms for the parties for the next elections to compete with, and instead of writing political programs in their offices. And I've seen some movements around these ideas and some better designed European citizens initiatives than in the past. So one. The other is that there is another movement. By movement, I mean activities, projects, initiatives, activism around the idea of transnational citizen assemblies. Now, in many democracies, citizens' assemblies have their established role. The difficulty is that the EU is not a country, hasn't got a single demos, as many demoi, and therefore they attempt. I've seen some movements, including in my institution, the EUI, to contribute to seeds, at least templates, exemplars of these transnational citizens' assemblies that can enrich. So this is not to say that representational democracy is off, is to corroborate representational democracy with some elements of participatory democracy that may be feasible for the EU as it is today. It's a little bit optimistic, but I think it's feasible.
László, would you like to add something?
Thanks. Yes, just to disagree a little, have a little disagreement. Yes, I think that one of the things that Claudio mentioned is demoi. There are multiple identities of the Europeans. So all the surveys, what one can see, show that people, and a growing number of people, feel Basque, Spanish, and European, or Hungarian and European, and there is an increase in these multiple identities, and that's I think a growing number of Europeans who don't have representation. So we have representation of 27 different nations in the parliament, and elections are at that level, but no representation of the Europeans. So I think that moving away from these systems, giving, besides the national representation, the different national diversities, giving also representation and European party lists might be the next step. Again, I don't think that it's feasible politically in the near future. I have doubts that there is strong enough support, but that should come. That will most probably come. The EU is a very archaic polity that is, just imagine the US run by the Council of the 50 governors without any kind of strong Congress or directly elected executive. These 50 governors would try to decide how to run the single market, how to run the monetary union, and so on in the US. And it's with an European economy that is much more integrated actually than the American economy. So I think that the longer run that will come.
Thank you. If I'm correct, we don't have any more questions from the audience. Would any of you like to add anything to our panel today? If not, then thank you so much for your insights today. And thank you for our audience for joining today's event. And have a lovely evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you and goodbye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.